My brother took my car without permission and taught me the value of forgiveness. My name is Steve, and I'm 23 years old. I've always liked to think of myself as someone who's getting life on track, working steadily, saving money, and keeping things moving forward. I live with my parents in a modest but comfortable two-story house in a suburban neighborhood in Ohio. My younger brother, Danny, is 18 and just about to graduate from high school, which has been a big topic around here lately. Between figuring out what he wants to do with his life and my parents constantly nudging him about college applications, our house is anything but quiet these days. One thing I take pride in is my car. It's a 2020 Nissan Rogue in a sharp blue color. Not exactly a luxury car, but it's mine, bought with my own money after years of saving up. I worked double shifts and skipped out on more nights with friends than I'd like to admit to afford that car. And honestly, it feels good every time I slide into the driver's seat, knowing that it's something I earned. The Rogue is in great shape, too. I wash it every weekend, vacuum the interior regularly, and make sure all the maintenance is up to date. It's reliable, comfortable, and, most importantly, mine. It gets me to work and back, takes me on weekend drives, and is always ready when I need it. Speaking of work, I've been a manager at a mid-sized distribution company for the past year and a half. It's not a glamorous job, but it's steady, and I like the team I work with. The people there feel like a second family in a way. Recently, the company decided to organize a week-long trip for any employees who wanted to go. The idea was to take us all out of the office and into a more relaxed environment where we could bond as a team. Management pitched it as a way to strengthen our sense of family, and honestly, I thought it was a great idea. When the trip was announced, I signed up immediately. A week away from the daily grind sounded like just what I needed. Plus, I thought it would be good to connect with my coworkers outside the usual work routine. My parents thought it was a great opportunity, and even Danny seemed interested, though mostly because he wanted to know if there would be free food involved. Before leaving, I made sure everything at home was in order. My room was clean, my things were organized, and, of course, I took extra care to check on my car. The Rogue is parked in our detached garage, which sits at the end of a short gravel driveway. It's a simple structure with white walls and a slightly sloped roof. Nothing fancy, but it keeps the car protected from the weather. I made sure the gas tank was full and everything was locked up tight. Funny thing is, I almost never lock the garage door. It's not something I think about much since our neighborhood is quiet and everyone knows each other. But that day, for some reason, I decided to double-check that everything was secure before heading out. The trip itself was fantastic. We went to a resort in Colorado, surrounded by mountains and fresh air. It was the perfect mix of activities and downtime. Hiking during the day, relaxing by the fire in the evenings, and plenty of chances to talk and laugh with coworkers. It surprised me how much closer we all became over those few days. There were people I'd worked alongside for over a year, and yet I learned more about them in a week than I ever did at the office. By the end of the trip, I felt refreshed, recharged, and ready to get back to my usual routine. We flew back on a Sunday afternoon, and after the shuttle dropped me off at home, I was greeted by the familiar sight of my house and the sound of Danny's music blasting from upstairs. Some things never change. My parents were in the kitchen, as usual, my mom flipping through a recipe book and my dad scanning the sports section of the paper. Felt good to be home. The next morning, after sleeping off the travel fatigue, I decided to check on my car before heading out for a grocery run. As I walked down the driveway, I felt that odd sense of satisfaction that comes from being back in your own space, in your own rhythm. But when I reached the garage, something immediately felt off. The door was shut. Now, that might not sound strange to anyone else, but like I said, I almost never lock the garage door. I remember leaving it slightly ajar before heading out for the trip, knowing I'd come back soon. My first thought was that maybe my dad had closed it. He's the kind of guy who notices little things like that and will take care of them without saying a word. But as I got closer, I noticed the lock looked different, like it had been turned and jammed into place. A small wave of unease washed over me. I pulled out my keys and unlocked it, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after a week away. When I pushed the door open, I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering in through the small window at the back of the garage. The air was cool, with that faint, familiar smell of concrete and motor oil. At first glance, everything seemed fine. The shelves along the walls were still lined with boxes of tools and old paint cans, and the lawnmower sat untouched in the corner. But my car wasn't there. I froze. My Rogue, my carefully maintained, hard-earned car, was gone. The empty space where it should have been felt like a punch to the gut. I scanned the garage again, as if I'd somehow missed it the first time, but of course, it wasn't there. My mind raced. Had it been stolen? Had someone borrowed it without telling me? I knew my parents wouldn't have taken it. They both have their own cars. And Danny? Well, he doesn't even have his license yet. Standing there in that empty garage, I felt a mix of confusion, frustration, and a sinking sense of dread. Something was definitely wrong, and I had no idea what had happened. When I came back inside that afternoon, I knew something wasn't right. My mom was in the kitchen, and she looked nervous, wringing her hands and avoiding eye contact. Danny wasn't anywhere to be seen, and my dad was sitting in his usual spot on the living room couch, staring out the window like he had something on his mind. It was my dad who finally broke the silence, laying out the details like he was confessing to a crime. Turns out, Danny had taken the car. Without asking anyone, he and a couple of his friends decided it would be fun to sneak out and go for a ride. It happened during dinner one evening when my parents thought he was upstairs in his room. I don't know if it was the thrill of doing something he knew he shouldn't or just plain stupidity, but Danny somehow managed to take my keys out of my room. He drove around the neighborhood, picking up his buddies, probably feeling invincible behind the wheel of my Rogue. But it didn't last long. Somewhere near the end of the ride, he misjudged a turn. It wasn't a high-speed crash or anything dramatic. In fact, from what my dad described, it seemed like he'd been going slow, but he hit something, a low concrete divider, maybe. The front end of the car took the brunt of the damage, specifically the passenger side. Danny had managed to drive it back into town, but when the car started making awful grinding noises, he panicked and brought it straight to a workshop, leaving it there without saying a word to anyone. Hearing this, I felt every muscle in my body tighten. My car wasn't sitting in the garage where I left it. It was in some workshop, banged up and broken because my little brother thought he had the right to take it on some joyride. I didn't even know how to process what I was hearing. Danny, it turned out, had been a wreck himself ever since. My dad explained that he was ashamed of what he'd done and scared out of his mind about how I would react. Apparently, he'd been physically ill from the stress of it all, hardly eating, barely sleeping. But none of that registered with me in the moment. I felt betrayed. When I finally saw Danny later that evening, he looked like a shadow of himself. Pale, tired, and visibly shaken. I tried to stay calm as I asked him why he took the car. I wanted to know what was going through his head, what made him think it was okay to pull something like that. But before he could get a word out, he wavered on his feet and collapsed right in front of me. The sight of him hitting the floor was enough to shake me out of my anger, at least temporarily. My mom screamed and rushed over, while my dad ran to get something to prop him up. Danny was out cold, and for a moment, I felt sheer panic. My frustration with him vanished, replaced by a wave of concern. Eventually, he came to, but his face was pale, and his breathing was shallow. My mom was crying, saying something about the stress being too much for him. My dad, meanwhile, kept muttering that he should have stepped in sooner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment my dad told me what happened. The sight of Danny lying on the floor, and the thought of my car, my beautiful, pristine Rogue, being reduced to a battered mess in some workshop. The mix of emotions was overwhelming. Anger, worry, disappointment. They all churned together, keeping me wide awake. The next day, I went to the workshop to see the car for myself. It was a small place on the edge of town, the kind of garage that smelled of motor oil and rusted metal. The head mechanic, a gruff but friendly guy named Ron, greeted me as I walked in. He seemed to know exactly who I was and why I was there. Without saying much, he led me over to my car. Seeing it was like a punch to the gut. The Rogue, which just a week ago was gleaming in the sunlight, now looked like a shell of itself. The front passenger side was crumpled, the headlight shattered, and the paint scraped down to bare metal in places. There were streaks of dirt and grime all over the body, and even the windshield had a crack running through it. Ron explained the extent of the damage in detail. The bumper would need to be replaced entirely, along with the headlight assembly. There was damage to the wheel well and some of the suspension components, too. The estimate for repairs? $4,500. Hearing that number made my stomach drop. That was more than I'd saved in my emergency fund. I'd worked so hard to keep that car in perfect condition, and now it felt like all of that effort had been for nothing. I tried to keep my emotions in check as Ron went over the list of parts that needed replacing, but inside, I was boiling. As I drove back home in my dad's car, the weight of the situation settled on me. I couldn't stop thinking about how careless Danny had been and how much this was going to cost. Not just financially, but emotionally, too. The car wasn't just a car to me. It was a symbol of my independence, my hard work, and everything I'd accomplished since starting my job. And now it was sitting in a workshop, a mess of twisted metal and broken glass. When I got home, I couldn't hold it in any longer. All the frustration, disappointment, and anger came pouring out. I confronted Danny, letting him know exactly how I felt. My words were sharp, and I could see the guilt written all over his face. But then, just like before, he swayed on his feet and collapsed. This time, we didn't wait for him to come around on his own. My dad called the doctor, and we spent the rest of the evening making sure Danny was okay. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about trust, responsibility, and the weight of expectations. Danny had made a mistake, a huge one, but he was still my brother. And as much as I hated what he'd done, I couldn't let this incident ruin our relationship. The next week was tough. Between dealing with the insurance, coordinating the repairs with Ron, and checking on Danny's recovery, I felt like I was constantly on edge. But somehow we got through it. The car would take time to fix, and Danny would take even longer to regain my trust. But we were moving forward. When the day finally came to pick up my car from Ron's workshop, I felt a strange mix of relief and hesitation. The Rogue was back to its original state, polished and pristine, just like it had been before Danny's ill-fated adventure. Ron handed over the keys with a satisfied grin, clearly proud of the work his team had done. I paid the hefty repair bill, $500, just as he'd estimated. And as I drove the car back home, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The car was fixed, and Danny had recovered, both physically and emotionally. He'd finally started eating properly and sleeping again, though I could tell he still carried guilt about what had happened. We hadn't talked about it much since that night, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was more careful, more considerate, and he'd even started picking up some extra chores around the house, almost like he was silently trying to make it up to me. My parents, too, seemed more at ease now that the chaos had passed. My mom wasn't crying anymore, and my dad had stopped pacing around the house with that worried look on his face. It felt like our family was finally returning to some sense of normalcy. Even Ron seemed to be in a great mood when I picked up the car, happily chatting about how the repair job had been a good challenge for his crew. But for me, the real challenge wasn't just getting the car fixed. It was letting go of the anger and frustration I'd felt, not just toward Danny, but toward the whole situation. For weeks, I'd been consumed by a sense of injustice. I kept thinking about how unfair it was that something I worked so hard for had been damaged because of someone else's careless decision. And yet, as I drove the Rogue home that day, something shifted in me. The car was just as it had been before, but my perspective had changed. I realized that I'd spent so much energy focusing on what was lost that I almost forgot what mattered most. The Rogue was just a car. A beautiful, dependable car that I loved. Sure. But at the end of the day, it was still just an object. What really mattered was my relationship with my family, and I couldn't let something as replaceable as a car drive a wedge between us. I've learned something valuable from all of this. It's easy to get attached to objects, especially when they represent hard work, independence, or personal milestones. But no matter how much you value something, it will never be more important than the people in your life. Cars can be repaired or replaced, but relationships, real, meaningful relationships, are much harder to fix once they're broken.